The Democrats, with all of their newly elected House committee hearing power, continued to find more ridiculous ways to spend the taxpayers' money. The 42-year-old Federation for American Immigration Reform arrived at the number of $116 billion for the amount taxpayers shell out to fund the Democrats' open borders policy. Now the Democrats want to continue their narrative of polarization and white guilt by offering taxpayer dollars to 42 million African Americans for reparations of the descendants of slaves, which by some estimates could total roughly $105 billion a year, 15% of the U.S. national defense budget. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who has been a member of Congress since 1995 and a leader behind the reparations legislation, forgot what it took one good American to point out.
H.R. 40 is in fact the response of the United States of America long overdue. Slavery is the original sin. Slavery has never received an apology.
In 2008, the House of Representatives formally apologized for slavery and Jim Crow. In 2009, the Senate did the same.
And what if reparations fails? Does this embolden the lunatics on the left and their leading candidate Joe Biden's call for a physical revolution?
Let's start a real physical revolution if you're talking about it.
And by a physical revolution, he is alluding to a race war that the Democratic Party would ignite. What are the 9 million mixed-race Americans supposed to do? Stay home and fight themselves? What about the exemptions? I'm a direct descendant of abolitionists who settled in Flushing, New York in the 17th century, who assisted with the Underground Railroad. Is my family exempt? What about the descendants of the 360,000 Union soldiers that died fighting for the Emancipation Proclamation? Are they exempt? And what about all the white people who immigrated long after slavery and the Civil War ended? Are they exempt too? The real issue with reparations, well, they generally pay out to living survivors. In 1988, the United States paid $1.5 billion in reparations to the survivors of Japanese internment during World War II, while Germany has paid $89 billion to the victims of the Holocaust. Will those survivors be paying reparations to the ancestors of those promised 40 acres and a mule by Union General Sherman that was interrupted after impeached Democratic President Andrew Johnson reversed the Freedmen's Bureau process that had already awarded 40,000 freed slaves 400,000 acres of coastal land in South Carolina and Georgia? The federal government, under a Democratic executive office, turned around and took that land by force. Unfortunately, that was the perfect window for reparations, because there were plenty of survivors, not 42 million people.
Nothing I'm about to say is meant to minimize the horror and brutality of slavery and Jim Crow. Racism is a bloody stain on this country's history, and I consider our failure to pay reparations directly to freed slaves after the Civil War to be one of the greatest injustices ever perpetrated by the U.S. government. But I worry that our desire to fix the past compromises our ability to fix the present. Think about what we're doing today. We're spending our time debating a bill that mentions slavery 25 times, but incarceration only once, in an era with no black slaves, but nearly 1 million black prisoners.
The history of our black country, of our black Americans, has been stolen from us for decades, almost over a century. Booker T. Washington, 1882, began Tuskegee University. By 1905, it was producing more self-made black millionaires than Harvard, Yale, and Princeton combined. The 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was a black community that led our country in the growth of the middle class, led our country in terms of men committed to marriage, over 70%, now it's 30%. Led our country in terms of the committed to business ownership, 40%, now it's 3.8%.
Are we going to base serious policy on white guilt, even if no taxpayer alive today is responsible for slavery? And does that mean my soul needs to be forgiven, Reverend?
And when I'm talking for reparations, I'm talking about those left behind, but I'm actually talking to my white brothers and sisters. You need this more than we do. You need this for your soul.
Your testimony about the fact that we're fighting for the heart of our nation. I think everybody in this room, as part of the American family, understands that. We see it different ways. Here's a question.
And then, frankly, when I hear from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that we need to be encouraged to work harder, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, that we can actually achieve, that's the only thing that's the problem.
This is just how inept the Democrats are with the leadership of this nation and how dangerous reparations are to this republic. You want reparations? Then why not start with the ancestors of the Southern Democrats that formed the Confederacy and the KKK?
KKK, that's not a Democratic Party, by the way. They lynched 4,700 people. 1,300 of them were white Republicans.
Or those responsible for the mortgage lending scams that targeted black America in the 1960s and 1970s. Or those responsible for overseeing the crack epidemic that put millions of black Americans in prison during the 1980s. Or those Democrats today who lord over their blue districts where poverty is increasing and education of our unifying principles are dying.
Let's point to the party that was part of slavery, KKK, Jim Crow, that has killed over 40% of our black babies, 20 million of them.
But aside from reasonably helping our fellow Americans, whatever race or races they may be, you can't blame millions of innocent people for slavery. It is the Democrats that must search their souls. Bottom line, Democrats, you opened up this can of worms, and in the end, it is your history that has doomed reparations for slavery and caused us to all see the truth that it was the Democrats who fought tooth and nail to keep reparations from legitimately happening all along.